The old apartment building stood shrouded in perpetual twilight. Its name, Blackhaven, was whispered by locals more than spoken. It was a place most avoided, a monolith of secrets better left undisturbed. At the end of a dust-filled hallway on the third floor, a black door stood. It was an oppressive presence, heavy and foreboding. The paint was thick, almost alive, and seemed to absorb the light. No one dared touch it, let alone open it. The black door was a silent sentinel guarding a mystery no one dared to solve. Elliot, a young writer seeking inspiration, moved into Blackhaven in the dead of summer. He was drawn to its isolation, its aura of forgotten stories. He felt a strange pull towards the black door. It was an itch under his skin, a whisper at the edge of his thoughts. He tried to ignore it, but the door became his sole focus. Elliot found himself standing in front of the black door more and more each day. He would stare at its impenetrable surface, his fingers twitching with the need to touch. He told himself it was research, a story waiting to be written. But deep down, Elliot knew it was something more, a darkness calling to him. One evening, while exploring the building's dusty basement, Elliot stumbled upon an old, ornate key. It was cold to the touch, heavier than it looked. It felt wrong, unnatural. He knew instinctively it was the key to the black door. He tried to resist the urge, but the key burned in his pocket, a physical manifestation of his growing obsession. Sleep evaded him, his dreams haunted by the black door. Driven by a force beyond his control, Elliot found himself standing before the door, the heavy key in his trembling hand. The hallway was silent, the air thick with anticipation. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't stop himself. He slid the key into the lock. The lock clicked open with a groan that echoed through the building, a sound that seemed to awaken the very walls around it. The air grew colder and the shadows seemed to stretch and deepen. The sound was ancient, filled with a sorrow that chilled Elliot to the bone. It was as if the building itself was mourning, whispering tales of forgotten times and lost souls. But it was too late to turn back. Elliot's resolve hardened, his determination unwavering. He had come too far, and the answers he sought lay beyond that door. As Elliot pushed the black door open, a wave of icy air slammed against him, carrying with it the scent of ancient, forgotten places. The cold was almost tangible, wrapping around him like a shroud. It reeked of decay and whispered of forgotten horrors. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of mold, rot, and something far more sinister, something that spoke of death and despair. He stumbled back, coughing, his eyes stinging from the foul air. Each breath was a struggle, each gasp a reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked within. He peered into the darkness beyond the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The void seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an endless abyss that threatened to consume him. It was an abyss, swallowing all light and sound. The darkness was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a living entity, a creature of pure shadow. Then, slowly, tendrils of black smoke began to seep out, twisting and writhing like living things. They moved with a sinister grace, as if they had a purpose, a dark intent. Elliot watched in horror as the smoke spread, seeping into the cracks and crevices of the building. It moved with a malevolent intelligence, seeking out every nook and cranny. A low hum resonated from within the open doorway, growing louder, more insistent. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones, a call that demanded attention. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, a tangible force that seemed to press against him. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with dark magic, a power that sought to overwhelm him. Shifting walls. In the heart of Blackhaven, an old building stood, its walls whispering secrets of the past. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. This was no ordinary building, it was alive, breathing, and ever-changing. The building began to change. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being rewritten. Rooms that once felt familiar now seemed foreign and hostile. The walls shifted, creating new pathways and closing off old ones, trapping its inhabitants in a maze of confusion and fear. The walls warped and twisted, the wallpaper bubbling and peeling. It was as if the building was shedding its skin, revealing a darker, more sinister layer beneath. The once vibrant colors of the wallpaper faded into a sickly hue, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. The hum grew louder, vibrating through Elliot's bones. It was a low, menacing sound that seemed to come from the very core of the building. The vibrations intensified, causing the floor to tremble and the walls to shudder. Elliot clutched his head in pain, trying to block out the relentless noise. He felt a primal fear grip him. It was a fear that went beyond rational thought, a deep-seated terror that gnawed at his very soul. His heart raced and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He began to hear screams echoing from the other apartments, desperate and filled with unimaginable terror. The cries for help were a haunting reminder that he was not alone in this nightmare. Each scream sent a shiver down his spine, amplifying his own sense of dread. But when he ran to help, he found the doors locked, the hallways stretching impossibly long. It was as if the building itself was conspiring against him, twisting and elongating the corridors to keep him from reaching the others. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and the walls seemed to close in around him. One by one, the lights in the building flickered and died, plunging Blackhaven into an oppressive darkness. The once faint glow of the hallway lights was snuffed out, leaving only the inky blackness. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and Elliot could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. The shadows danced with growing confidence, taking on monstrous forms. They seemed to move with a life of their own, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The darkness gave them power, and they fed off the fear that permeated the building. Elliot watched in horror as the shadows crept closer, their forms becoming more defined and menacing. Elliot watched in terror as a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was swallowed whole by a wall that seemed to breathe, her screams abruptly cut short. The wall pulsed and contracted, drawing her in like a living organism. Her desperate cries for help were silenced in an instant, leaving only an eerie stillness in their wake. He was trapped in a nightmare, a prison of his own making. The building had become a living entity, feeding off the fear and despair of its inhabitants. There was no escape, no way out. Elliot could feel the walls closing in, the darkness consuming him. He was a prisoner in a place that defied all logic and reason, a place where the very walls seemed to whisper his doom. In the heart of the night, Elliot found himself in a place where shadows seemed to have a life of their own. The air was thick with an unspoken dread, and every step he took echoed with a sense of impending doom. Elliot tried to close the black door. To undo what he had done, his hands trembled as he pushed against the ancient wood, the door creaking ominously in response. It felt like he was fighting against an invisible force, something that was determined to keep the door open. But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how much strength he mustered, it remained ajar, as if mocking his efforts. The more he struggled, the more it seemed to resist, almost as if it had a will of its own. It was as if the building itself was holding it open, hungry for more victims. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer and darker, whispering secrets of the past. The very air seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, feeding off his fear. Panic clawed at his throat. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he felt the weight of the building's malevolence pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. He was trapped in a living nightmare, the building groaning and shifting around him. The walls seemed to move, closing in and then retreating, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. Each creak and groan echoed through the halls, a symphony of terror. The air grew thick with the smell of decay and fear. It was a stench that clung to his clothes, his skin, seeping into his very soul. The fog that filled the hallway was dense and suffocating, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The shadows whispered his name. They seemed to know him, to understand his deepest fears and regrets. Their voices were soft, almost gentle, but filled with a chilling malice that sent shivers down his spine. Desperate to escape, he raced through the building, each turn leading to more horrifying scenes. The corridors twisted and turned, a maze of terror that seemed to have no end. Every door he opened revealed new horrors, each more terrifying than the last. A Apartments were empty, furniture overturned, belongings scattered as if the occupants had vanished in an instant. It was as if the building had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only the remnants of their lives. He was lost in a labyrinth of his own creation, the black door's darkness seeping into his mind, whispering to him, claiming him as its own. The more he tried to escape, the deeper he seemed to fall into the abyss, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. The next morning, the sun rose over a bewildered city. Blackhaven, the building that had cast a shadow over the neighborhood for decades, was gone. Police and firefighters swarmed the area, their faces grim as they surveyed the empty lot where the building once stood. There were no survivors, no wreckage, no trace of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Elliot's disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. Theories ranged from a gas leak to a mass hallucination, but no one dared speak the truth. The truth was too terrifying to comprehend. Days turned into weeks, and the initial shock gave way to a chilling acceptance. Life, as it always does, moved on. The city rebuilt, paving over the lot where Blackhaven stood. A new park, bright and cheerful, now occupied the space. A stark contrast to the darkness it replaced. But beneath the surface, a sense of unease lingered. The locals still spoke of Blackhaven in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously towards the park whenever they passed. The city had forgotten, but the shadows remembered. Somewhere in the unseen corners of the world, a black door stands ajar. The darkness it unleashed lingers, waiting for the next curious soul, the next unlocked secret. For curiosity, like the shadows, can sometimes lead us to places we were never meant to go, and once opened, some doors can never be closed.